Hi everyone, welcome to the first inaugural event of the Writers' Summit. Thank you, and that's okay because to begin with, I really want to first introduce the Writers' Summit and what we are as an organization. So who are we? The Writers' Summit is a student-founded organization founded by Craig Bukenya and Ariba Saeed, who are here. And the aim of the Writers' Summit is to bring insightful discussion with journalists and writers to a wider audience, often to those who haven't had access to these kind of conversations in the past. We also want to offer individuals the chance to interview our guests, often eminent guests, and we also want to offer upcoming and aspiring writers who are developing their skills the chance to discuss their own work and why they're writing. And with that, that brings us to today's event with Jade Barnes. I know Jade's here. Hi, Jade.
Hi.
Hiya.
Hiya.
So Jade is the culture and arts editor for Durham's Bubble magazine, online magazine, and she's here to discuss her most recent article, I believe, Andrew Tate, Donald Trump and Witchcraft, Anti-feminism in the media, which already is a really exciting and interesting title. I hope everyone here has had a chance to read it, but if not, we'll be covering many of the themes today, I hope, and also some of the wider debates that may stem from what Jade's written. So in terms of the plan for the event, I will kick off with an interview for 15, 20 minutes or so. Then I'll hand over to my colleague, Charles, who then continue that conversation. And then we'll then head to a Q&A. So please, throughout the event, any interesting questions that you may have, anything you want to ask around the article, any of the wider points of discussion, please send those questions to me, ideally, because then you can keep your own name anonymous. So please send the questions to me, and then I'll put them in the Q&A. So the only other point of housekeeping is to keep your cameras off, keep your microphones off, so we can avoid any of the Zoom mishaps that are go so viral sometimes. Anyway, so apart from that, let's kick off this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it with Jade. So I guess to start things off, Jade, I'd really like to ask, you've written in the past about Gandhi, about the Salvadorian Civil War, about Halloween. Why did you want to turn your attention and focus to anti-feminism in the media?
Sorry, it won't let me turn my camera on. But I like to write about topics that I feel we can link to events happening today. And I think that with current rise of the Me Too movement and certain figures being so prominent in media today, like Andrew Tate, I thought it was quite interesting to look back into how events in history may be similar and seem to lead up to what we're currently experiencing now.
Okay, brilliant. I'm sure we'll come to a lot of those themes. I just wanted to ask whether you enjoy the writing process. I've had a lot of writers say they don't really enjoy writing. I'm curious if you enjoyed writing this article, or if it was more about having to struggle through the process because you believed that the message that you were trying to communicate was important.
I tend to enjoy the process, but writing this one was more stressful because I knew that obviously the topic can often be quite controversial, so I wanted to make sure that I did it right and wasn't any false information in it. So it was quite meticulous in going over it and making sure that there wasn't any kind of assumptions being made. But other than that, I did enjoy writing it, and I do tend to enjoy writing them.
I mean, that's already a really interesting point that you raised, that even though you're writing for a student magazine, there's a risk that something you could write could blow up, perhaps among parts of social media that, as a fan of Donald Trump and Andrew Tate. I mean, why do you think it is that social media has gotten to this point that it's so polarized and so toxic that even a student writer has to be so careful not to say anything that's wrong or too controversial?
I think just because of the accessibility of social media, and also with some of the people that I was talking about in this article, such as Andrew Tate, I think a lot of their following comes from being at one far end of opinions. So I guess that just makes it, they kind of can latch on to a strong opinion. So the stronger the opinion, the more widespread it seems to get.
Okay, yes. I think there's a lot there to unpack, and I think we'll come to it. I guess I still want to understand firstly a bit more about your own perspective from the article. So we were discussing a bit earlier, and you said that you would call yourself a feminist, yet it really stuck out at the end of the article. You say that only 17% of female undergraduates in the 1990s regarded themselves as feminists. And I was looking today, and it was still only about 1 in 5 of young women in the UK call themselves a feminist. I'm curious from your point of view, why do you think you would call yourself a feminist, and why have you avoided what you argue has happened to a lot of women, that they've sort of been persuaded by the media not to call themselves a feminist? Yeah, why do you call yourself a feminist?
I think just when you look into what the definition of feminist actually is, you know, someone who just wants equality and equal opportunities for all genders, then I think when most people hear that, they'd agree and they'd think, yes, that's something that I believe in as well. But I think because in the media, feminism has been so demonized as a very far left ideology, a lot of people try to stay clear of it because they don't want to associate themselves with something that seems controversial. And just because as well, you know, like the demonization, there's a lot about people saying feminists want more than equality. So I guess a lot of people want to stay clear of that assumption that that's what they want as well.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me really nicely to the beginning of your article, and in which you mentioned Me Too movement straight away. And I'm curious how you view the media's role in the Me Too movement, and whether you see that as the media promoting a feminist cause.
I think it began as the media promoting a feminist cause, but obviously a lot of the Me Too movement now faces a lot of backlash with it being such a public movement. Obviously, if someone comes forward publicly, then they can then be attacked. So I think it definitely began that way. I was reading earlier, and it was quite interesting how the movement itself hasn't managed to take off in the UK as much because of libel laws in the UK, which I guess with the media aspect, that's quite just interesting to see how that comes into it all.
Yeah, I'm curious if you think that social media and the media more generally, if you think they are particularly biased in attacking feminist voices and feminist causes, or if you think that media aggression or the media toxicity, as we were talking about earlier, if that can also attack the anti-feminist movement as well, and the anti-feminist side of things, like Andrew Tate and Donald Trump. Does the media have both wings of toxicity?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen recently that it does have both wings of toxicity in how, with the ability for someone like Andrew Tate, who's so anti-feminist, to rise, but then also the condemnation of him as well. We've seen kind of both poles there. But I think another point in the article about the reports on UN conferences does kind of indicate that it is quite ingrained to be more against feminists, in how, rather than focusing on what actually happens at the UN conferences, they focused on women bickering. And that was across a sample of more than 50 different news sources. So I think if you take the majority, it seems to be more anti-feminist based, and then the pro-feminist and seems to be more rare amongst the majority.
Yeah, you discussed in your article also the successes of second wave feminism, which felt like a brief moment of positivity regarding the feminist movement in your article when you discussed the 1970 Equal Pay Act in the UK, 1975 Sexual Discrimination Act. I'm first of all curious why you think in that decade, second wave feminism seemed to somehow elude the media's aggression or against it. And then also I'm curious to know how you assess third wave feminism. How is it doing now? Or even the current incarnation of feminism.
So I guess the second wave feminism, the second wave feminists themselves did use media to their advantage in many ways, but with like campaigning and placards and just making sure that like the message got out, different forms of peaceful protest. But I do find it interesting that most feminist movements, at least the second wave feminist movement, did stay quite away from the media, rather than using it as a force. Whereas now in third wave feminism, with things like the Me Too movement, we can see how feminism is trying to like encapture the media into its own campaigns. But again, it is interesting to see the backlash that then faces each wave of feminism that we have.
Yeah, I'm curious. One final question about sort of the media and demonization before I hand over. I was reflecting again on a time when social media seemed to really, and maybe the mainstream media as well, seemed to really adopt a sort of pro-feminist stance in response to the murder of Sarah Everard. But then in response to that, there started to become a spread of the phrase, not all men are responsible for assaults and abuse against women. And I guess that was many anti-feminist voices in media arguing that men were being demonized on social media. Do you think it's possible that men have been demonized on social media? Is it possible to say that Andrew Tate and Donald Trump have been demonized on social media as well?
I think it's definitely possible to say that men have been demonized by the media as well. I think it just tends to be more individuals and based on an individual's activity or something that one person has done, as in with Andrew Tate and Donald Trump. The attacks made against them don't tend to be attacks against their entire gender. But then their points are that they become attacks against the entire gender, and that then you need to like remasculate. But to go back to the question, I think definitely both sides can be demonized, but in the Sarah Everard case, again, I think with the popularity of Not All Men after such a like vivid example of misogyny and like abuse towards women, just showed that the focus maybe isn't where it should be, as in the focus is often removed from progressing women's rights and women's voices and is shifted to, well, not all men are bad, whereas it'd be nice to be able to progress with the focus on women's opportunities.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That's really complex subject, and I know Charles, I'm going to hand over to, has some more questions sort of on the general broader themes of the article as well. So Charles.
Thank you, Luke. I'd just like to build on much of what Luke said, Jade. So could I start by asking you, please, you talk in your article at the start about Donald Trump and Andrew Tate, but do you think that the fact that 8 women, for example, have accused the current president of the United States, Biden, could you not have used him at the start of your article?
Yeah, I definitely could have used Biden at the start of my article, but because the focus of this article was how different forms of media come into it, I feel like Donald Trump is somebody who has used his social media platforms more actively than Joe Biden did in gaining his following. As in, a lot of Trump's initial support came from his Twitter accounts. So I thought it would be interesting to use 2 examples where they are big social media presences to kind of show how that might influence it. But also you raise an interesting point about how not many people would be as aware of the current allegations against Biden, and how maybe because he isn't as large as a presence on social media, that has gone a bit more under the carpet than Donald Trump's allegations were.
Could you theoretically say then, Jade, that perhaps Biden's allegations of sexual misconduct have gone under the carpet, perhaps because of the influence of the media?
You could potentially argue that, but in doing so, you're also kind of arguing that because of media, again, ignoring the women who have come forward and said, this has happened to me by this man. So again, it does kind of show a bias in the media in not publishing those allegations as widely as maybe you would expect them to be published.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very interesting. So looking more generally at your article, you mention a lot of examples in history about where the media have limited feminist debate. Would you mind clarifying to me about how this can be stopped in the future?
Well, I think to go back almost to what we were saying about the Sarah Everard case and how if the focus had remained on what was happening to women at the time, maybe there could have been more progression there, more laws could have been made, more provisions put in place maybe. But because the media immediately shifted it to not all men, I think that it kind of stunted some progress maybe. So I guess moving forward, if the media could focus more closely onto the issues of women's rights and women's opportunities rather than shifting focus onto the counter-attack immediately, then it would more likely create progress, I suppose.
Could you give me another example then of where they shift focus onto the counter-attack, please?
So I guess with the Me Too movement as well, or even with the Epstein cases, immediately after the certain details about that were released, rather than focusing on, well, something terrible has happened to these women, they were focusing more on, well, this person might not have actually been involved. How do you know that they were involved? And obviously, because there was big names involved again, that's what kind of got the attention rather than the issues at hand.
Okay, that's a fair point. But then I would ask you, don't you have the principle in this country and in the United States of innocent until proven guilty?
Oh yeah, definitely. But when you look into the statistics around certain issues like abuse, even if we didn't focus on the abuser, maybe if we focused on what the abused or allegedly abused has potentially gone through and how we might prevent things like that from happening in the future, rather than on the, well, they might not be guilty, so just keeping it surrounding the attacker, if that makes sense.
No, makes perfect sense. Thank you. And to bring the questions on here, do you think that overall it's impossible to stop anti-feminist voices from gaining mass media support?
I think from what we've seen recently, it certainly seems very difficult to stop it because, you know, with current schools saying that, you've got school teachers currently saying that the rise of Andrew Tate and figures like that means we need intervention in teaching. The extremity of that would maybe suggest that it is getting more and more difficult to stop the popularizing of such voices in the media.
And I suppose also with Twitter being unregulated, as their new owner, Mr. Musk, wants to create it to be like that. So then I would say, what would you do specifically to counter this misinformation in particular?
I think there just needs to be definitely obviously with social media, because everybody can publish whatever they choose to, you can't really make sure that there is fact checking going on before somebody says something. But certainly in publishing industries, like in the newspaper, I think it's important that everything that's said is fact checked and that people aren't just being allowed to make things up without it being checked. Again, like in the article, I mentioned how Trump's tweets involved lots of misinformation surrounding the elections, but there didn't seem to be a big voice saying, this is misinformation, don't listen, which I think is one of the biggest issues surrounding anti-feminism in the media, that the demonization is just taken as, well, that's what happens, rather than it being checked almost.
Okay, so would you then, I suppose you're supportive of perhaps greater regulation in the media, is that correct?
Well, not to the extent that there's any kind of censorship or anything, but I think just when stating facts or claiming to be stating facts, those facts should be accurate, especially in an industry that's been checked, like the Daily Mail, for example. They should probably make sure that the facts that are being published in the Daily Mail are actually accurate. Obviously on social media, you can't do that because it's a self-publishing form, but I think it would be helpful for those facts to be checked in certain media forms.
So we talk quite a lot about how social media perhaps should regulate or fact check. Do you not think then that the former, Twitter's approach with Donald Trump, where they put a little information thing saying this might not be factually correct, was good enough in the last US election?
I think with regards to Donald Trump, much of the damage had already been done by the time that came around. But I do think it's definitely a step in the right direction, because obviously with something that is a self-publishing form, it's difficult to make sure that misinformation isn't spread. But I do think it's definitely a positive addition to the platform.
Okay, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, I want to stress that, but you focused a lot of your article on Donald Trump. Do you think there's any realm or way that you could see him actually helping women and actually empowering women? And for example, Ivanka Trump, his daughter, who runs most of his business, he had Nikki Haley as the US ambassador to the United Nations. Do you think that perhaps shows that he's not such a patriarchal figure?
I think the issue isn't necessarily that he's a patriarchal figure at all. I think much of the issue is that a lot of the controversial things that he has said even though he might be hiring these women, the audience that he is approaching are hearing the anti-feminist bits, and they're probably not actually aware that this man has also hired women, but they'll know the opinions that he's giving on them. So I guess when you've got a mass audience, that's an issue that comes with it, that you can't always separate the two.
But is he not then very different to Andrew Tate? Andrew Tate is a boxer who is also alleged to have been involved in prostitution, whilst whether or not we like it, Donald Trump was the freely elected president of the United States.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to include them both was to show how they're in very different positions, but very similar devices have led them to those positions. So they've both are very anti-feminist, and they're both using social media platforms, but one of them became the president of the US, and one of them is technically a kickboxer. And they're very different, but they're both influencing so many people through the media. And I think that's what I wanted to stress in the article, was not even as much just what one person is doing, but the influence that they are then having on a broader audience.
Okay, thank you. Quite a lot of your article then focuses on the media. So I would say, or perhaps pose a question, that you could see the media have been quite good actually in promoting feminist voices. And I would give you an example with Fiona Bruce and Emily Maitlis at the BBC and Kay Burley at Sky News. And I would further say that this has not been the case, would not have been the case in the 1950s.
Yeah, I think we're definitely making progress. And as much as there is lots of prevalent anti-feminism in the media, there's also a lot of pro-feminism there. I just find it interesting that the voices that seem to grow the largest and the platforms that seem to be the biggest, they're the ones that tend to be anti-feminist. Again, within the example of the UN publishing, the fact that so many different news sources all took that conference and decided not to focus on the issues, I just find it interesting how broad the anti-feminism is.
Okay, you focused a lot on the UN. I think there's a very interesting point there. But would you take your argument further to say that there's been, you could see the TV press as being different to the social media, and as much that the TV, like BBC, Sky News, is not as overtly anti-feminist as perhaps the mainstream Twitter or Facebook?
Yeah, I think definitely TV press such as the BBC, which is regulated, tends to be a lot less biased one way or another, which I guess is one of the reasons why we uphold the BBC so much, because it, in many regards, not just in regards to feminism, it's at least meant to be an unbiased platform, which I think again goes back to when things are regulated and fact checked, they tend to give a more objective story, and then people can then go and make their own opinions, whereas social media, being self-published, probably will never get to that point.
Do you think then that with even the BBC, for example, an all-women's news show or news hour, for example, would be a good way to promote feminist voices?
Yeah, I do. I think that would be positive, but also I guess the concept of having to have a separate entity to discuss women's issues is somewhat problematic in itself, as if we want to just kind of bridge gender divides in adding more aspects to it, it's not ideal. but I think in the current climate, that might be one of the best ways that we could spread more feminist ideas and the like.
Great. I should quickly chime in with a question. We've talked a lot about how social media in particular has been really polarizing and has had a lot of anti-feminist voices, but isn't the reality of social media that it's very much an echo chamber? I doubt you're following Andrew Tate or followed Andrew Tate, and I doubt you see many of his tweets, or I doubt you potentially see many tweets from Donald Trump before he was banned from the platform. Isn't it more a sort of reflection of the general political persuasion of the population that such a large number of people are following Andrew Tate and Donald Trump, and then also on the other side of things, a lot of people are following pro-feminist voices? It's not necessarily that people are being persuaded by Andrew Tate or Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think you're right in that in following Andrew Tate, you're making a choice to listen to that voice. No one's holding you captive and forcing you to listen to it. But I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the article was how it might be that we're being influenced by more mainstream things that we don't really that we don't choose to follow, which leads to that becoming popularized. As in, most people probably have heard the phrase that feminists want more than equality, regardless of who they follow. And that kind of phrase being spread might then lead to more opinions being made, which has led someone to wanting to follow anti-feminist voices almost.
Sort of going to the end of your article now, you call this cycle in the media, quote, a repeated cycle. So I would infer from that you seem somewhat pessimistic about the media. So I would ask you, do you not think that it will slowly get better?
I think over time we are seeing it slowly get better. It did end on quite a pessimistic note, but I think obviously when we look back at the earliest example I used of the witch trials, I think we've definitely progressed since then. But I think obviously now that we're in a time when more media is becoming more accessible to more people and more publishing forms are more accessible, it feels like now would be a good time to highlight maybe these patterns and try and break them.
Okay, thank you. And also just bringing this debate perhaps further, do you think that men and women are different? And if so, how are they different?
Well, obviously there's biological differences, but I think that because men and women are treated different immediately dependent on their assigned gender at birth, that creates more differences than what maybe we'd have without that difference in treatment. I mean, it's a very shallow point to make, but as in when you have a baby girl, you might dress them in pink, and you have a baby boy and dress it in blue. It's just something as simple as that just kind of demonstrates that dependent on gender, you're treated differently. And obviously that stems out in almost every other aspect of life, which then creates what we think might be differences to now.
So then I suppose that the media could be quite useful in tackling these gendered norms.
Yeah, and I hope it will be. Well, I do think that it definitely can be very useful in tackling gender norms, but the article itself was more focused on, rather than gender norms, was focused on the anti-feminism aspects, but I think it's definitely interesting to look into.
Another thing which really struck me about your article, and a debate that I think it links with, is the extent to where freedom of speech goes. And I know we sort of skirted around the sides here, but I want to ask you directly, do you think that freedom of speech has a limit, and where should you stop it?
my general policy is that freedom of speech ends when hate speech begins, because obviously hate speech can become quite dangerous. But there are intricacies within that, and as someone who's a history editor for The Bubble, I'm aware of the importance that freedom of speech has, and I wouldn't try and limit someone's freedom of speech, but more in big publishing houses, I do think it's important to have fact checks, for example. So yeah.
Okay, so do you then think that what Donald Trump said, or has he actually said anything like Andrew Tate said about women, which constitutes hate speech? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't, on women's rights, I mean, yeah, obviously he said a lot of other stuff, but do you think he said anything explicitly anti-women, misogynistic?
None come to mind right now, but I do think that he said things that probably wouldn't be considered hate speech and would still be considered freedom of speech, which are quite anti-women. But I don't know exactly whether he said things that would be considered hate speech, like Andrew Tate when he's encouraging violence against women. I couldn't clarify whether he has gone that far or not. I'd probably assume he hasn't, but yeah.
Do you think then on reflection, you would have chosen someone else other than the 45th US president to start your article?
Well, no, because I don't think the article was focused on hate speech as the main aspect. It was more that he has said things that are very anti-women, and he has allegedly done things that very publicly allegedly done things that are obviously like abusive towards women. And I wanted to draw on how somebody who had 18 very public sexual abuse allegations managed to be voted into the presidency of what we call the free world, which I do think still ties into the general themes of the article.
Interesting. On that point, on what you decided to include in your article, I am curious why you wanted to talk about witchcraft and go back so many hundreds of years, and what caused you to bring in that point and to talk about witch hunting, and perhaps some people wouldn't see the relevance so much in the modern day. I'm just curious, what motivated you to include it?
I was reading about the not current, but the more recent witch trials in African states in the early 2000s. And I feel like many people would think of the witch trials and think of something from the 1500s, the 1600s, something completely outdated and completely absurd. But in reality, it was so recent that they were still ongoing. And I thought that that was an interesting link to make and see how that has similarities to what we see today in other media publishing forms.
You mentioned the genital mutilation in Africa. Do you ever see the media properly covering that dreadful tragedy?
In my experience, the only time I've seen things covering that the recent tragedies there has been when I've gone out and searched for it. I've never really seen it just on the BBC or in mass widely published news forms unless I've gone to find it myself.
But aside then from you alleging or suggesting an anti-feminist streak to the BBC or political news agencies, do you think that there are other reasons why it might not be covered, like geopolitical relations, for example?
Yeah, I think definitely because in Western news, there tends to be a focus on the Western, and we don't tend to get much news regarding African states, especially. I think that definitely comes into it. But yeah, no, I do think that's definitely a major contributing factor to why that hasn't been addressed. But I think it really should be addressed in news forms. And I think global news should probably be promoted more to a wider audience.
Perhaps they should have BBC World News instead of just BBC News London.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a positive development.
One final, or probably not quite final, we've got a few more minutes, but a lot of these issues are, I guess, exacerbated by social media. Although we've got our qualms with the tabloid press and the BBC, they're not perpetuating the same issues which Twitter or Facebook are. So do you think then that feminist groups should perhaps stay away from social media outlets?
I think in staying away, they might be prohibiting themselves, because obviously in these examples we've seen how powerful social media can be in shaping careers, in giving people immense platforms and opportunities. So I think by completely excluding that group from social media, that would also be very much damaging to their potential.
But you don't think there would be a better platform? Because the issues with social media, as we see with J.K. Rowling, regardless of our views on the transgender debate, is it's a culture of toxicity. And I would almost say that feminist groups, which are perhaps preaching objective truth, are better to look at other forms of communication.
Yeah, I think definitely, I mean, personally, I would value other forms of communication above social media when trying to spread something such as feminist ideology or any kind of politically related ideology. But I feel like because wider audiences tend to get a lot of their information from social media, I'm not sure whether we have the privilege to completely avoid it at this moment in time, really.
Thank you for that. Luke, would you like to start with the Q&A session?
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Jade. You've been an amazing start to the Writer Summit and have defended your articles, arguments very well. So yeah, please, if you have any questions in the for the Q&A, just send them to me and then read them out. My first question is about Andrew Tate and his discussion in schools. The question I asked, they've heard that schools are preventing pupils from talking about Andrew Tate, presumably in order to stop his publicity from spreading. What's your opinion on this, Jade? Schools clamping down on discussion of Andrew Tate?
I think in itself, rather than maybe stopping the discussion entirely, I think schools should be trying to encourage maybe a shift in the discussion, and instead of just saying you're not allowed to talk about him, he's off limits, saying, oh well, actually maybe this is problematic what he said because, and then kind of going into detail and trying to maybe reshape the opinions that might have been formed there.
Yeah, and on Andrew Tate as well, we have another question. What do you think are the main dangers to today's youth of the growing popularity of Andrew Tate? How do we prevent those dangers from taking hold?
I think one of the main dangers is that Andrew Tate on record has said a lot of very detailed things regarding the abuse of women and how women should be handled per se. And I think one of the things that is damaging is that if that becomes a normalized topic and a normalized idea, that might end up encouraging more abusive behavior. And I think we should try and counteract that and make sure that that is not something that becomes normalized.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. How does third wave feminism, or how does feminism fight back against what seems to be these very powerful, publicly discussed anti-feminist voices? What's the feminist movement at the moment missing that it can't really control the narrative in the way that, say, Donald Trump was able to control the narrative? How do we fight back?
I think that what we see is every time that feminist movements do fight back, they tend to almost make progress, and then because of the constant demonization surrounding feminism, that progress immediately gets stunted and prohibited almost, which I think was kind of alluded to when I said how when in the 1950s, after women had made progression in the workplace, in the film media at the time, you'd see images of women in the household and stuff like that. So I think it's just interesting to see that every time progress is made, it kind of circles back around to what is feminism and what do people think feminism is, and how that's impacting how much progress feminism can have.
Yeah, and that links in with another question, which is, where is the line between anti-feminism and misogyny? Yeah, well, where is that line, and does it take calling anti-feminist voices, calling them anti-feminist, sort of create hate and violence against women?
I think anti-feminism tends to be targeted at the feminist movement, whereas obviously misogyny can just be targeted at women as a whole. So like, for example, anti-feminism could be saying, oh, feminism is doing this, feminism is doing that, whereas misogyny would more likely be based at women are doing this. But I do think the line can definitely be blurred. And in many of the instances with someone like Andrew Tate, you tend to see a combination of both.
Cool, there's a comment here that feminism is no longer needed. I'm curious to kind of flesh that out. We discussed earlier that only 1 in 5 young women in the UK would call themselves a feminist. We can only assume that for young men, that would be an even smaller proportion would call themselves a feminist. I guess, what does feminism have to offer? In particular, what does it have to offer to men in order to try win over people who've been disillusioned?
I always find it interesting when discussing sexual abuse, when people say one of the main counter arguments for looking at violence against women is, well, there can be violence against men too. And I always consider looking at violence against men also a feminist topic, because one of the main reasons why violence against men isn't addressed as widely as violence against women is that people don't view women as capable of enacting that violence, because people don't view women as equal from the get-go. And I always find that quite an interesting one, because I think often one of the main cases made against feminist movements would actually benefit from the feminist movement.
Could I just interject now, Luke? That's okay. Linking this then to perhaps our current, or Ukraine's current war with Russia, dreadful tragedy which is happening there. Do you think then that women should perhaps be also staying in Ukraine to fight against the Russian invasion? Because currently it's only legal for men. Men have to fight whilst women don't have to.
I do think that when conscription is introduced, then there shouldn't be a need for it to be stuck to one gender. But also, when looking at that, I guess a counter argument is that women still don't have as many privileges as men, as in, someone might say, well, I'm not being paid the same amount, so why should I then go and fight this war maybe? But I think in the strive for general equality, then that's definitely something that should be considered.
Why are not more feminists pushing for it then?
I don't know. I think they probably should be, but I guess in the current climate of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, I feel like people are probably focusing their attention elsewhere.
Okay, brilliant. I guess another question we have from the audience is, what do you say to young men who feel lost and look to figures like Andrew Tate because they feel underrepresented or neglected in society?
I think just, again, it comes down to what feminism is, and a lot of the people who might be subjected to Andrew Tate's opinions, they have this already like pre-existing idea that feminism is anti-men, whereas I think just in clarifying that feminism is not anti-men, that in itself would probably go quite far.
Yes, okay. Final question to pivot, not final question, sorry, but it's another question to pivot slightly. Would you think that having to provide ID as part of the account creation process for social media, would that help to regulate the platform? Would that help to stop social media becoming so toxic? I mean, how do you think avoiding that toxicity in general is possible?
I think as far as like providing IDs in the form of a lot of hate comments on social media are published by anonymous accounts, I think in taking away anonymity, then a lot of people's misinformation and hate speech would probably be prevented. But I'm not sure how that would be achieved without stirring up quite a ruckus, really.
Okay, yes. And I guess reaching the end, but I'm curious your view on the line between masculinity and toxic masculinity. That's a question we have. And judging by some of the questions in the comment section, do you think there's a line between, say, femininity and toxic femininity? Is that an issue?
I think there's definitely a difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity and femininity and toxic femininity. And I think that they're both probably quite prevalent issues. Yeah, I definitely think that masculinity and femininity in themselves, I don't think there's much problem with them, but once it gets to a toxic level, obviously that's then when things become very problematic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jade. That brings us to an end. It's been a very, very wide-ranging discussion, but that's only because you really wrote a very fascinating article with loads of different points that really branched off nicely into a really interesting conversation. So thank you so much, Jade, for that and for all your answers today and for withstanding some tough questions. Thank you so much also to everyone who came in and watched this conversation. Hopefully you'll see some of it again on social media. There is a form that we'd love people to fill out just to get your views on how it went. And if I can't send it on here, then I'm sure one of my colleagues will be able to send it. There we go. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'd really love to point people towards our upcoming events. We have one with an Oxford professor, Lena Salamea, a really interesting article about imperialism and the law, I believe. And then coming up, we have another interview with best-selling author Emma Smith talking about the relevance of Shakespeare. And then we also have, in the further future in February, if you look at our Instagram, you can see our event card. We have one with Ben Mercer, who's a book talker. which is very exciting. And some more events lined up with journalists. So I really hope you found this very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking part. Thank you to Jay once again, to Charles for some more questions, to our founders, Ariva and Craig. Thank you so much. And yeah, everyone have a really great evening, and hopefully see you for the next one on the 15th of February. Good evening.
Thank you, Jade.